Terry, welcome once again to the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. It's so great to see you.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. I am delighted to be with you guys.
Hi, Terry. Richard here. Wonderful to see you again. It's been such a thing. We haven't been able to travel. Missed you. So it's good to see you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I know. I miss coming to Australia and seeing you guys in person.
Yeah, it's been really difficult, hasn't it? Living our lives virtually on screens, but
Yes.
It is what it is, and hopefully we're coming out of that soon.
Yes, and this is one advantage to being able to do it, that we can actually have a conversation across half the world is amazing.
Yeah. Okay, Terry, you amaze me continually about with your output. Another book. I mean, how do you do it? You must spend the majority of your time writing, must you?
Oh, no, not at all. I've been spending hours playing the piano each day, and I dance almost every day. And of course, I have my practice, but I live on fractal time. And if you want to talk about that, that would be a good podcast for it.
Okay.
Because
yes, we have mentioned fractal. Yeah.
Yes, but I would say, my output has increased. I've gotten less obsessive about details and more into flow, and I'm doing well with the flow. I'm able to just do something once and keep going. And this book is a very short one, actually. This was an invited monograph, and so it's much shorter than a normal book. It's almost like an extended essay. So.
Right.
It's true, because the fractal epistemology came out like the same year, which is sort of amazing.
Yeah. So Mythic Imagination Today, you've got an interesting subtitle there, the Interpenetration of Mythology and Science. Tell me, what does interpenetration mean?
Ooh, you know what? Interpenetration is a fabulous word, I think, for any therapist who is intersubjectively or relationally inclined, because it really means, in terms of subjective experience or intersubjective, it means the self is in the other and the other's in the self. It means there's a full penetration of each side of a boundary into the other. And so I sort of struggled with this relationship. It evolved for me between science and mythology. I started out thinking that both were coming from the same place, that both were sort of coming from the right brain, and converging in a sense, that mythology converged into science. But I realize it's very much like assuming the unconscious converges into consciousness. Not the case. I think they are separate tracks, just like the unconscious and the conscious mind are separate tracks in the brain and the body, and they don't converge. They have a relationship, just like mythology and science has a relationship. Each has a relationship with the other, and that has evolved over time, of course. And the earlier is mythology, and the roots of science are in mythology, but they definitely are coming on separate tracks, right brain versus left brain tracks, I think.
Right.
And I think this is a really fabulous extension of our general discussions of complexity and emergent properties and so on and so forth, because the whole idea of complexity, which you and I have talked about and we've talked about here a lot, is we certainly do have an observable emergent whole that we see, but it is coming from the interreaction of differentiatable elements, so elements that we can actually see as having a degree of separateness.
That's true too. Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about integration, sure, that's lovely, but that's very much about the emergent property. But in the process of interaction that goes on before it emerges, this idea of the term that they penetrate, that they perturbate with each other and create disruptions, create harmonious elements, create all kinds of different things that then can be seen in a degree of separateness, even though we know they have eventually a complete connectedness.
Well said, Richard.
Okay, that's good. So I mean, because I love that in the abstract, it's beautiful. You talk about mythology as perception and plus imagination, and science as systemic observation and experimentation, which is beautiful. Although I can see perception applying in both areas.
Of course, yes. And projection also. And perception and projection.
And so, is this the way in which they can sort of penetrate each other? Is this through these common elements? What's
sure. Yeah, through common, absolutely through their common elements. I think perception is a really important one. That mythology comes. Both come from fundamental curiosity about how the world works. The dopamine circuit, essentially, that sends us out into the world, experimenting in order to get our needs met, is the same circuit by which tool formation happened. And of course, starting in mammals, it's not us, it's not just us. So science, you could say there's a sort of proto-science in animals who use tools to enhance their perception and enhance their mobility. And clearly, I'm sure there is a left brain element to that as well in animals and mammals that use. It's not just mammals, actually. Birds use tools, and it's pretty interesting how the more we learn about the animal kingdom, the more sophisticated we are able to observe, the more we see they are sophisticated beyond what we thought. But perception and our hands. I know, Richard, you're really into, sort of the hands as tools and as communications and all of this. So this combination of perception and movement underpins both mythology and science. How things work. I think the stars are a beautiful illustration of what started in mythology, seeing regularities in the stars and then telling stories. And I think that's the other common element is the need to tell stories. So, and especially origin stories, which is why this book focuses a lot on creation mythology. But that's another important element, is wanting to understand where we're coming from. And mythology does that, science does that. But with the stars, initially the Greeks, and I'm just starting using the Western world, and I understand that science, a lot of sophisticated science preceded that in other parts of the world. But in terms of the Western world, the Greek myths were thrown up into the sky. And then eventually the mythology got drained out of the understanding of how the stars rotate and work and this sort of thing, as it was used for agriculture and planting and so there's both interpenetration, but then there's the division over time in evolution, in human evolution, so that they became really separate branches. But I love that you're focusing on interpenetration, because I think it's still there in both science and in mythology. And I know for myself that my own spirituality comes from science and through science. And so understanding how these things interpenetrate is really helps us to think holistically, more holistically, which I am convinced has to happen logically everywhere.
So are you saying, from sort of the science side, you have then sort of gone back and explored the mythology side to make sense of the science?
Yeah,
or
I go back and forth, but
right.
yeah. I'm saying that for me, if you think of science as only being the left brain, reductive kind of science, because I'm interested in, I know you guys are interested in the nonlinear science, which is actually more like a right brain science than a left brain. And yet it's science is inherently more left brain, and there you can see the interpenetration as well. So because mythology is a pretty purely right brain kind of thing and more holistic. And so as we get into nonlinear science, there's that interpenetration is actually happening yet again. So I think there was a separation, and now it's coming back together. It started together, it separated, and in some ways our understanding of these two areas are coming back together, especially with secular humanism, for example, too.
Right.
And those of us who, are interested in quantum models of holism as well as fractal models. My epistemology is a fractal model of holistic thought. So, so these are important ways that this interpenetration happens.
Yeah, and just talking about, you mentioned quantum, some of those early 20th century physicists and mathematicians, certainly there was a lot of right brain, inspiration, creativity that, sort of spawned some of these ideas. And then they went to sort of maybe the left brain to prove,
Right.
to make proofs. But
right, and that's a good point, that the creative process always starts on the right, moves to the left, for either for systematic testing or observation or checking and this sort of thing, and then back to the right again.
Yeah.
So, and I also bring up the quantum because my latest paper, so I also have two papers that are coming in psychoanalytic dialogues. One just came out with Yaakov Shapiro, who's one of the people that psychiatrist in Canada, who is one of the editors of the Fractal Epistemology. And we did varieties of clinical intuition, the local, meaning you're sitting in the room, body to body, person to person, perception is direct, and the non-local, which is all that uncanny stuff, psychic stuff, which us therapists encounter all the time. And I stayed away from initially when I was doing clinical intuition, but now I'm comfortable enough. I feel more grounded in the science. Anyway, so we did a quantum model for non-local information sharing.
Okay, interesting. When does that come out?
It's out. It's out. It is. There's two commentaries and a response to the commentaries. And then next issue of Psychoanalytic Dialogue will have a fractal model of synchronicity and two commentaries and a response. And so, I guess I am interpenetrating, if you will, science with psychology and neurobiology, this kind of different kinds of science, whether it's fractal geometry or it's quantum. And it's really Yaakov is the quantum expert. I'm the epistemology expert. But and telling stories is the other piece. As I teach clinical writing, which I do at Pacifica, I have gotten so tuned into how our brains are wired to tell stories, and the more that I can present this information as story, the more compelling it is, I find, what teaching or in any way, because otherwise it just goes over people's head. And I'm gaining confidence that there is a way to tell a story about these ideas that can touch anyone if I'm smart enough to tell it that way,
Yeah. The thing that interests me, the word that kept popping up as I was going in, is the word literalism. And seeing it as I've always seen it as a sliding scale. This interesting thing, I was listening to something the other day as I was preparing for this, was Neil deGrasse Tyson, and someone was asking him about gravity, and he said, well, science can tell you what gravity does, because we measure it. We can tell to some degree how it does it, because we look at various things, but we have no idea why it is. And I think this is one of the things that for me gives a lot of difference, is that in science and in a lot of Western culture, we're looking for what is right, for what is correct. Whereas in mythology, we're looking for what gives form and shape and what gives connection a lot more,
and what gives heart.
And what gives heart. And I think this is of course one of our greatest problems, is where beautiful mythologies, which I see occurring in a lot of religious areas, belief-based systems, sort of imagine story of things, where there's this rather vigorous argument to try and make it literal. So it becomes discordant. But as you've gone through and you're talking in this whole process, one of the important words that really comes through is metaphor, which covers this whole thing. So I wonder if you could just give us a bit of a expansion on that's really the one that all my chatter has just led to.
Yes. Okay. Well, the more I delve into all these areas, the more the body is the center of it all. And so the Lakoff and Johnson perspective of embodied metaphors really colors my way of thinking. And so their idea is that starting with babies, it's metaphor that allows a bootstrapping process from a very concrete, I'm going to stick a bowl on my head as I'm a little baby, and that's a hat, and that's a concrete metaphor. And over time, as words and concepts get understood in this embodied way, then the body drops out. It gets more and more abstract and less literal. And metaphor, so they believe that metaphor is at the basis of all cognition, and I believe that too, all understanding, that it's all metaphor in the sense that we're always working with similarities and differences. So we use the similarities to bridge over to something new, and then the differences to explore what's different about it. And just, it's like a fractal, iteration over and over again into these new areas. And so metaphor is both at the basis of the most primitive form of cognition, but then it's also at the basis of the most extraordinary forms of creativity, whether it's artistic creativity or scientific creativity, and all the creativity researchers, bisociation kinds of ideas, where those are all metaphorical, where two different things come together and to create something new. And it's really through metaphor that can happen. And so when we look at mythology, it's all metaphorical, but it's very, very interesting that something as basic as math, you would think is like the most concrete thing of any, also according to Lakoff and Nunez, is also metaphorical. And so it turns out that the idea even of a number, which crows can count, so, animals can count, but the idea of a number is metaphorical as well, depending on whether you think of it as a point on a line or an object in a group. There are several different metaphors of how number can be conceived, and each one leads to a different branch of mathematics, and they sometimes contradict one another, which you don't think about math as being inherently contradictory, but it is. And so right and wrong breaks down. It breaks down. Right and wrong isn't the best way, because complexity includes paradox. And so things are the universe is inherently paradoxical at all levels. At the quantum level, with wave and particle, and psychologically with opposite feelings and motivations, and even math has this inherent contradiction in it. And so we got to sort of let go of thinking there's absolute truth or there's absolute correctness, and embrace the metaphorical nature of everything. Wow, that was like quite a...
That's beautiful. I mean, because linguistics, which is, where I did a lot of my, and still do a lot of my work, is the same thing. Language itself is a metaphoric representation, and as an interpenetration of language structure and our reactions to the world, our integration with the world. But I just want to bring it into the therapy room a little bit. Now, am I drawing too long a bow? And I know I say this sometimes, and but I'd love to get your response. That actually, what we call mental conditions that we observe, those emergent properties, depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth, they in themselves can be looked upon as metaphors for something to take us as a way of taking us into the deeper space beneath them.
That's interesting. I have never thought of it that way, and I'd have to think about it a little more to, sort of make that connection. Certainly in therapy, I think more in terms of our story about ourselves and who we are, and how metaphorical that is, how mythological that is, going back to mythology. Like, all of the goddess women as goddesses, or that whole movement that came out decades ago is one example. Or taking mythological stories of the Greek gods and understanding our own psyche and according to them. Which, by the way, did you like that the way that I reinterpreted the myth of Psyche, which is the whole origin of psychology?
Yeah.
The word psychology and the word psyche. So that's more how I think of it, rather than symptoms metaphorically. But I'm sure there's something to what you're saying. I'd have to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a sort of a thought that arose in my mind as an element of the way I've interpreted them. Because looking at the Greek gods particularly, they were named after emotive states. They were, and we have that, in our certainly in the Aboriginal dream time, and we have it. A lot of the American Indian stories, we see these idealizations of mental states and emotional states in the gods.
Exactly. I think that's a good way of looking at it, is that the reason that these stories are so resonant psychologically is because they emerged initially from the psyche, they're projected out, they get interjected back in ways that become meaningful to people, because there's a universal element to it. There's also obviously cultural specific elements too.
So on that point, are we able just to take a step back and talk about maybe, what are the core myths and how did they come about, and of what utility are there? Because I'm assuming there are a core, we could identify a core set of myths in all of their variations.
Well, yeah, and clearly Jung spent a lifetime, and Joseph Campbell also, and looking at the core myths of the good mother, the bad mother, the witch, and the guide, spiritual guide, and this sort of thing. But I think when it comes to looking at science and mythology, it's really useful to look at the core set of myths around creation stories. And Marie von Franz has a beautiful book called Creation Myths, and a lot of my thinking about this and about our understanding of origins, because of course, when Freud embraced the Oedipus myth, apparently that's when his whole system took off. That was a way that, which is really interesting to me, that that became the myth of universal myth of development for him. But in terms of creation stories, there are a lot of different, a set of core myths. So for example, God as create artist, for example. Like a lot of indigenous culture has humans being fashioned out of clay, and different stories of or being using the fire to get them, to ripen them, or this sort of thing, or potter, being a potter and God is potter. So there's that is one set, and then there's a sperm and egg set where there's this germ of creation in the universe that sort of fits human fertilization processes. But then the one that I really focused on in this book is the difference between top-down and bottom-up myths. And I was really excited to link that to human physiology, which as far as I know, no one's done that before, where myths that are top-down, for example, are Western Judeo-Christian. Yeah.
Yep,
Christian.
That's good.
Is a top-down one because God is up in heaven and creates the earth below.
I see. Yeah.
Your Aboriginal myths are bottom-up ones because I think that the gods are down in the middle of the earth and sort of emerge out to the surface.
Yep.
And so a big difference that Van Franz talked about is that when it's bottom up, it's more sort of instinctual. It starts in the instinctual end. And when it's top down, it's more cerebral. And so, which fits with the difference between the right brain being this emergence up from the body to the mind through the senses and the emotions, whereas deliberate thought, conscious reasoning is a top-down process from the thought into the body and actualization and material existence and this sort of thing. So that these two different directions are particularly interesting in terms of imagination, the relationship between imagination and perception from a neurobiological point of view, because it turns out that they follow the same pathways and that there's a bottom up and top down in both of them, but imagination has a little more top down and the other is a little more bottom up. So perception is a little more bottom up, but we still do top down. So when we think we see something and we project that into the world, but it turns out it's not that, that's an example of imagination leading perception.
Which is what we see in when it becomes dysfunctional or discordant, we see in our mental disorder of I suppose that also extends out to when you have errors in the neurobiological functioning and you move into delusions and those other various other types of things.
Schizophrenic types of processes. But it also extends out to those of us who've become so disembodied in everyday life that we literally see a table, but we don't see the table. So perception drops out and we're just projecting the category onto the world. Yeah. And it gets devoid of really, an experiential element.
Yes, I remember reading somebody who was saying, talking about this very thing of the degree to which we perceive and create reality and so on and so forth. And he said it's entirely reasonable that the table in front of you is there in some sort of reality or is there in some kind of perception. But if you're curious and wondering, just walk towards it and see when your knee hurts, which was interesting. So the idea of that is just this where things intersect and collide. That creates something, and I think it's that collision. Because you get interpenetration, which is beautiful, right. And then you just get collision and refusal. Is that something that this barrier between this science and mythology how does that express itself in?
Well, see, I would say that it's got a fractal boundary, which mostly everything else does, which would mean that it depends on what scale you're looking at it, whether it's an open boundary or an interpenetrating boundary or a closed boundary.
Okay, I see. Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
right. Which pretty much every other boundary is, and that's the fractal epistemology book is all about boundaries, which we should do. Did we ever do a podcast on that? I can't remember.
We did some on the fractal thing, but that particular element, which is so important in the therapy room,
right, so important
as a part of your observing skills.
Right,
I'm going to have to go back and read that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. And, if there is not interpenetration in the therapy room between the patient and the therapist, no healing will happen, because otherwise it's two separate people and they're just taking turns, but they're not really taking in the other. And if the other is not taken in, there's no transmutation of anything, nothing.
No co-creation.
Yeah. When we're talking about psychopathology, can we? So, do you see the fingerprint of mythology in all psychopathology?
That's another interesting question. With all these interesting questions, not necessarily. I mean, I wonder, though, or maybe if what you mean is there a mythological story that corresponds to all psychopathology? I'm sure there is.
Okay. Yeah.
Like especially those gods, those Greek gods, for example, a lot of them were really angry and they killed. Right. And they were sociopaths, and or how about those trickster figures that steal and that trick and, and I love the trickster. I love the trickster figure. It's very paradoxical kind of figure. So yeah, probably in that sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm watching the Disney thing at the moment with Loki. Oh,
you are? Yeah.
And there's some certain things about the story which I go, I don't know. But there's so much interesting stuff about watching when they get it and when they're just sort of doing movie making, and you go, whoa, trickster! Wow, we just don't know where we got. And I think the actor gets it. He gets it, but he doesn't get it. But he certainly portrays it really nicely.
So Loki is in my book, and I think it's a really good example because he winds up getting punished by the gods by having, oil dripping down on him, hot oil, I think, and then it is the origin of earthquakes, as I recall. Loki's punishment is the origin of earthquakes. Now, what's interesting about that is that the trickster figure is a metaphor for chaos in nature, for unpredictability in nature, and earthquakes are the prototypical chaotic chaos in nature. And this is where ancient wisdom circles back around to modern science. And that is another part of the interpenetration.
Yeah. And so it gives you that sense of why as you're exploring the what and the how.
It gives you a little bit of a sense of why, but it also gives you chills to think about science discovering something that ancient people talked about without any scientific basis. And that's where intuition is really smart, where intuition is the most complex perceptual category. So I think that this all comes from, intuition just being so attuned, the most attuned and the most complex and the most holistic way of understanding the world. And of course, as we were saying, every scientific discovery starts out with a right brain intuition that then gets verified through the left brain. So there it is in that circle from the right to the left, back to the right again, which also we do it as therapists all the time. We start out, we come in with open attention, trying to turn on our right brain, and then we hear a detail, we focus in, we ask for explanation, we go to the left, then we go to the right. We keep going back and forth really rapidly, shuttling. So that's concept of shuttling is also important for how that interpenetration happens.
Yes, I'm always fascinated how modern people get fascinated at earlier perceptions, and of course we invent stories of the aliens came and gave it to us, and because those people couldn't possibly have had the knowledge. And as you say, this intuition plus attunement is an extraordinary thing. And, we go back to the atomists in the Greek times who were looking at these tiny particles, having this intuitive, attuned perception that nature could go down to those elements was not was what the people describe as so beautifully, not being a genius, but tapping into the genius.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you've captured that opportunity for us to understand beautifully in this book. I think that's one of the elements that I adored. It gives me the opportunity to believe that I can tap into the genius.
Go for it, Richard.
Well, I was recommending that everybody go read the book because they hopefully will feel the same.
That's a good idea too. Thank you.
But when you write these things, the other ones, the fractal work, the epistemologies, these things, you constantly give me hope and confidence in my own creativity, and that's the joy. And that's why I love talking to you,
Oh, I love talking to you too. And I think
that's brilliant. Yeah. And we'll also get we'll get some links for your recent writings as well that you mentioned. We'll have to point our people to that as well.
So now I think we've arrived at a bit of a pausing time. I think the world is now wanting to go and think about this enthusiastically. So we'll call it a close for now, because you're not going anywhere, we're not going anywhere. We'll certainly come and talk again.
Awesome. Yeah. I would love to talk again, and thank you so much for the opportunity to do it.
Fantastic. Terry Marks-Tarlow, thank you so much for being here on the Science of Psychotherapy. It was so great to talk to you.
You are most welcome, and thank you so much, Matt and Richard.
Thank you. See ya.